I yield.
All right. Thank you. Hi, my name is Julie. I'm an advocate for reproductive rights and justice, and I am here today to share some information about tripling the mandatory wait for abortion. These bills would triple the current mandatory waiting period for abortion from 22 to 74 hours, 3 times longer than what the Supreme Court has said is constitutional. Forcing a woman to wait even longer before accessing medical care does nothing to improve her health and will push her abortion later in pregnancy. House Bill 1307-1313 has now been amended to require the Department of Health and Senior Services to create a video that contains all the information required to be provided to a woman considering an abortion. If passed, a woman seeking abortion services at least 24 hours in advance would be given a state-scripted counseling that includes medically inaccurate information designed to try to change her mind. The same politically charged information would be repeated 3 times in person, in writing, and in the forced viewing of a video. Abortion is a deeply personal and complex medical decision. Ultimately, decisions about whether to choose adoption, end a pregnancy, or raise a child must be left to a woman, her family, and her faith, with the counsel of her doctor or healthcare provider. A woman should have accurate information about all of her options. Information should support a woman, help her make a decision for herself, and enable her to take care of her health and well-being. However, Missouri women who have made the decision to have an abortion and have the resources to travel to the only abortion facility in the state endure numerous restrictions once they get there. A woman receives state-scripted counseling that includes medically inaccurate information designed to try to change her mind. After the biased counseling, most women must wait, even if they have traveled many miles from home, and then go back to that health center at least 24 hours later before having the procedure. Senseless state mandates unnecessarily put women's health at risk. Delaying care based on political and not medical reasons puts women's health at risk. While abortion is a very safe procedure, it is safer the earlier it is provided. The challenges women may face in scheduling travel, childcare, and work arrangements to get to doctor's appointments 72 hours apart means the procedure could be forced later into the pregnancy, posing a senseless risk to women's health. This is not for politicians to decide. Implicit in this bill is the unfounded assumption that women who decide to have an abortion don't carefully consider their decision. The reasons women decide to have an abortion are complicated. One thing that's certain is women don't turn to politicians for advice about mammograms, prenatal care, or cancer treatments. And politicians have no business in a woman's personal medical decisions about her pregnancy. For nearly 100 years, Planned Parenthood has promoted a common-sense approach to women's health and well-being based on respect for each individual's right to make informed, independent decisions about health, sex, and family planning. Planned Parenthood health centers provide a wide range of safe, reliable health care, and more than 90% is preventive primary care, which helps prevent unintended pregnancies through contraception, reduce the spread of sexually transmitted infections through testing and treatment, and screen for cervical and other cancers. Many things can happen in pregnancy. We cannot presume to know what is best for a woman and her circumstances. A woman should not be blocked from the care she decides is best for her and her family. Take, for instance, Dana's story. In a piece she wrote that was published in the Baltimore Sun, she describes the story of her second pregnancy. In December 2009, she wrote, "This past July, I was happily pregnant and eagerly expecting the arrival of our second child. For nearly 8 months, I had been loving my baby in utero and explaining to our 2.5-year-old son that he was going to become a big brother. Never in my worst nightmare did I imagine I would need to have an abortion, and certainly not late term. At my 28-week sonogram, the ventricles in our baby's brain measured a little elevated, and I was sent for further testing. 2 weeks later, I had an MRI, and my worst nightmare was realized. We learned the baby was missing a main piece of its brain. The part that connects the right and left hemispheres literally wasn't there. Additionally, the surface of the brain was malformed and severely underdeveloped. Despite all of my prenatal care and testing, this was not detected until I was 7.5 months along, and no amount of surgery or physical therapy could change this horrific diagnosis. We learned that our baby would have had ongoing seizures and would lack the physical coordination to suck, swallow, feed, walk, talk, or know its environment if it survived being born. The sonogram already showed the baby was not swallowing, and in hindsight, I believe the constant movements of the baby were the result of spasms caused by brain abnormalities. If we had carried our baby to term, we would have needed a resuscitation order in place before the birth, as our child would have been incapable of living without significant medical assistance. We did not want our child's existence to depend solely on feeding tubes and machines. We did not want to bring a child into this world who would only be here in a vegetative state, never knowing his or her big brother or parents. For this child, for our son, and for our family, my husband and I made the heartbreaking decision to terminate. We did the most loving, humane act a parent could do, put an end to our baby's suffering. I was too far along in my pregnancy to obtain care in Maryland, so my husband and I had to travel to Colorado, to one of a handful of facilities in the U.S. that provide later abortion care. Our upfront medical expenses totaled $17,500, and that doesn't include the additional costs we incurred for our cross-country travel. Although I was told that my insurance does cover abortion, I am still waiting to hear whether my insurance carrier will reimburse me for any of my care. Dana was writing her story in the midst of debate over whether women should have access to insurance coverage for abortion. Her comments about denying care because of a lack of funds are even more compelling when care is denied because of prohibition on doctors performing services, such as we are discussing here. Dana wrote, "As I listen to the debate regarding abortion coverage in the proposed healthcare system, I can't help but ask, what about circumstances like mine? How can families, especially federal employees, facing such a terrible prognosis, be omitted from insurance coverage from abortion? The majority of private health insurance plans cover abortion. However, the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program prohibits coverage of abortion except in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment. This policy forces federal employees and their dependents in my situation to pay out of pocket for abortion care. To be forced to carry to term because of lack of financial coverage is beyond cruel. The week between learning the devastating diagnosis and when I terminated was agonizing. Each movement of my baby, movement that for months had brought me such joy and reassurance, was an excruciating reminder of what was never going to be. To force women to endure this for several more weeks and give birth because of lack of medical coverage is outrageous. I am writing today for all of the women who are too fearful or made to feel ashamed to put on a face to abortion. I'm writing today for all the women who, like me just 5 months ago, never imagined they would need the help of an abortion. And I'm writing today on behalf of my child, who I know is in a much better place and no longer suffering. This is Dana's story as published in the Baltimore Sun. The article is titled, "My Abortion Anguish. Why Should Women Who Need Them Have to Leave the State and Pay Thousands of Dollars?" For another example, listen to a story from Christy in Virginia. These are Christy's own words. It was October of 2002. I was 31 years old and was married with a 20-month-old daughter named Miranda. My husband and I had decided it was time to give Miranda a baby brother or baby sister. I didn't want the age gap between Miranda and her future sibling to be any more than 2 or 3 years. I wanted her to grow up as close to her siblings as I had been with my sisters. I finished up my pack of birth control pills early that month and was planning to chart my cycles for a couple of months before actively trying to conceive in January. By mid-November, I had completed one normal cycle and had begun charting my second and final cycle before gearing up to begin actively trying to conceive in January. During the latter part of that second cycle, I felt a strange tightening feeling in my stomach one day while exercising. Since I had been charting my cycle, I knew that if I took a home pregnancy test, I would know with some certainty whether I was pregnant or not. I took the test. It was positive. I was so shocked since we weren't even actively trying to get pregnant yet. Our second baby was coming. The morning of my 20-week ultrasound was filled with excitement and anticipation. My husband had taken the day off from work so he could come with me to see if we were going to be giving Miranda a baby brother or a baby sister. Like most parents-to-be, we believe the whole purpose of the mid-pregnancy ultrasound was to determine the gender. As he and I sat in the waiting room, he teased me about the fact that females tend to run in my family. I had 2 sisters, 2 stepsisters, 3 nieces, 2 step-nieces, and 1 daughter. He was so convinced that this baby would be another girl, so we started tossing around possible names. We had decided then and there the name Madison, if it was a girl. We were called back to the ultrasound room, where, for the most part, everything seemed to be fine. The ultrasound technician asked if we wanted to know the gender of our baby, and we enthusiastically said yes. It was another girl. We were so excited to be giving Miranda a baby sister. I assumed that the technician was wrapping things up and taking some final pictures when she asked us to remain in the room for a minute and then walked out. 5 minutes later, she returned with one of the other OBGYNs from the practice, who explained to us that the technician couldn't get a clear enough picture of the baby's heart. She explained to us that we would need to do a maternal fetal medicine specialist the following day for a level 2 ultrasound to look at the baby's heart and also to look at the baby's spine, which appeared a bit abnormal. We were shocked and bewildered that anything was potentially wrong with our baby. We left with a script in hand for an appointment the next day to evaluate fetal heart and spine. I called my mom, who lived in a different state, as soon as we got home from the ultrasound appointment. I mustered all the enthusiasm I could to tell her that the all-female streak in our family was being continued. But then I broke down and sobbed that something might be wrong with the baby's heart. The following day was Good Friday. Our appointment with the perinatologist was at 11 a.m. My husband and I dropped Miranda off at a babysitter and proceeded to the office. As we sat in the waiting room, I was naively unaware of the significance of Madison's health problems. We knew that something might be wrong with her heart and possibly her spine, but assumed that they could be fixed. As the technician performed the level 2 ultrasound, the room was tense, dark, and eerily quiet. She took numerous pictures of Madison from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. At one point during the ultrasound, the technician typed on the screen, "diaphragm hernia." I had no idea what that meant, but assumed that if the baby had a hernia, it could also be easily fixed. After about 45 minutes of taking pictures of our baby, the technician very quietly left the room. The doctor came in about 10 minutes later. He introduced himself, shook our hands, and then immediately said, "Your baby is very sick." Those 5 words would change everything. He proceeded to tell us that Madison had what was called a left-sided congenital diaphragmatic hernia. For some unknown reason, her diaphragm never closed properly around 8 weeks gestation, and as a result, her stomach and intestines had migrated into her chest cavity. The extra organs in her chest had prevented her lungs from growing. Her trachea and esophagus were pushed out of their normal position, and her heart was pushed over into her right armpit. Her heart seemed to be okay for the most part, though it was in the wrong place in her chest, was twisted around almost backwards, and I would later read in a formal report that her heart did have possible outflow abnormalities. But her heart wasn't the primary area of concern. It was the lack of lungs that was the critical factor. As long as Madison was inside of me and her blood was getting oxygenated from the placenta, she would be okay. However, once she was born and the umbilical cord was cut, she wouldn't be able to breathe on her own. Even a ventilator couldn't help her if there wasn't enough lung tissue to inflate. We were devastated by all of the things the doctor was telling us. I'm sure that some things he said to us that day went right over my head. I was in a total fog once he told us how sick Madison was. It all seemed like a bad dream, and I wanted desperately to wake up. The doctor asked me to get dressed and come into his office so that we could talk some more. Once my husband and I were in his office, he told us that Madison's hernia was one of the worst he had ever seen. He showed us a medical reference book that included a diagram of a diaphragmatic hernia. He then mentioned the option of termination to us. I believe he called it interruption. But I was not fully convinced yet that our situation would warrant that. I still had an iota of faith that Madison's problems could somehow be fixed. It was a combination of denial and naivety. I asked him if most parents with CDH diagnoses terminate the pregnancy, and he said that many of them do. At that point, we were 20 weeks and 5 days along. Given the laws in our state, We would have 3 weeks and 1 day to decide whether we wanted to interrupt the pregnancy or not. The doctor told us that if we wanted a surgical termination, a dilation and extraction, or D&E, he could refer us to someone. And if I wanted induced labor termination, my own OB could perform it. It was a Friday afternoon, so the doctor told us to think about everything over the weekend and call him back on Monday. We left the office that day unsure of what would happen next. It was Easter weekend, and I tried my best to remain cheerful and upbeat for Miranda. But inside, I was dying. I spent endless hours on our home computer researching CDH, researching lung development, and researching experimental procedures of in utero repairs. I started posting on an internet message board for families of children with CDH. I talked online to many of moms of kids with CDH. Some of them had children who survived. Some of them had children who didn't survive. Over that weekend, I would wake up several times in the middle of the night to get back on the computer and do more researching. I was looking for anything to give me hope that my Madison might be okay. I was clinging to the overall 50% survival rate for CDH and hoping that my Madison would be one of those survivors. Over that weekend, my husband and I repeatedly discussed the options of termination versus carrying to term. We literally went back and forth about 20 times as to whether we would continue the pregnancy or not. We finally decided that we needed more information in order to feel comfortable making a decision either way. Monday morning came, and my husband and I called the doctor we had met with on Friday and asked him to set up a second opinion level 2 ultrasound for us. We were scheduled for one the next day. We went to the scan and found this doctor to be very kind and accommodating toward us. He was very helpful and very considerate, taking his time with the scan and making sure that we understood everything he was explaining. Unfortunately, his medical opinion concurred with the opinion of the first doctor that our Madison had a very bad case of CDH. He explained to us that, although the overall survival rate was 50%, the survival rate drops significantly if CDH is found before 24 weeks, which ours was. He told us that Madison's chances of making it to term were 10 to 15%. He told us that if she lived through childbirth, she would need to be immediately put on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, heart and lung bypass machine, and that she would need to be on it for quite some time. I had learned about ECMO from my internet research and knew that extended use of it could lead to blindness, hearing loss, and potential brain damage from brain bleeds. We walked out of the second opinion ultrasound knowing what we had to do. We didn't want Madison to suffer for even one more second, and we didn't want Miranda to see her baby sister suffer in a body that was too sick to perform the most basic bodily function, breathing. We didn't have any family in the area to help us out if we had chosen to continue the pregnancy, and I was certain that all of the technology in the world couldn't help my Madison anyway. Lung transplants are not done with newborns. I also felt there was a reason that we found out about her CDH so early instead of at birth when many parents do. I knew that I needed to trust my instincts and follow my heart. As much as I didn't want to say goodbye to my baby, I knew that I had to. For the previous 5 months, every piece of food that I ate, every bit of exercise that I trudged through, and every wink of sleep that I got were to nurture her to grow and develop. I had bonded with this little baby and had so many hopes and dreams for her. She was to complete our family, and now I would have to let her go. We called my OB when we got home that day and asked her to schedule us for a labor and delivery termination. I chose L&D because I desperately needed to see my baby girl. I needed to kiss her sweet face and hold her tiny hands in mine. I had to see her just one time. My OB's office was able to call my insurance company for the necessary pre-approvals for my induction and hospitalization. I didn't realize at the time it was even a possibility my termination wouldn't be covered by my medical insurance. Luckily for me, it was covered at the same rate my full-term induction with my 2-year-old had been covered at, 80%. My induction was scheduled to begin 2 days later, on Thursday evening. I was to deliver Madison in the exact same hospital where 2 years earlier I had delivered my daughter Miranda. Thursday afternoon I had to leave Miranda in the care of a neighbor so that my husband could come with me to the hospital to get checked in. My mom and sister were set to fly into town later that evening to help us with Miranda and to provide us with much needed emotional support. Once I got to the hospital, I was walked into a labor and delivery room at the very end of the hallway. I'm assuming that was for my benefit, so that I wouldn't have to hear all the other laboring moms-to-be and their newborns. I was immediately hooked into an IV drip of Pitocin. My OB came and inserted 8 sticks into my cervix to begin the dilation process. I had asked my OB and the nurse if it would be possible to check for Madison's heartbeat periodically with the Doppler so that I would have some idea of when they passed, and she agreed. My mom arrived at the hospital at about 8:00 p.m., just in time to say hello and to hear her newest granddaughter's heartbeat for the first and last time. Visiting hours were ending, so I sent my mom and husband home to help my sister, who was looking after Miranda. I didn't think that anything was going to happen with my labor during the nighttime anyway, so I figured they might as well go home and get some rest. The laminaria didn't do much to dilate my cervix. When my OB returned at midnight, she removed it and placed a suppository in my cervix. After inserting, she told me that it would need to be replaced every 4 to 6 hours or as needed until I dilated adequately. For a tiny baby like mine, that would mean only 6 centimeters or so. It made me pretty ill. I had persistent vomiting and diarrhea for the next 4 or 5 hours. I thank God for the wonderful night shift nurse who took care of me, because I know that it was no fun to care for me during these hours. It was not pleasant at night, and I got very, if little, sleep. My OB returned at about 8:00 a.m. and inserted another suppository. At that point, I was still only about 2 centimeters dilated. I had the nurse check again for Madison's heartbeat, and it was still there, as strong as ever. The second suppository that my OB inserted seemed to do the trick. I started getting very painful and very strong contractions about 20 minutes after the insertion. I asked the nurse for an epidural at that time, about 8:20 a.m., but unfortunately the anesthesiologist was tied up in a C-section delivery and couldn't break away to help me. When my mom and husband arrived at the hospital at about 8:40 a.m., I was in agonizing pain. The nurse tried to alleviate it with some morphine shots into my hips, but it didn't help. The only relief I felt was after my water broke at about 8:45 a.m. The nurse checked me and said that I was about 7 centimeters dilated and that Madison's head was crowning. My OB was immediately paged, quickly arrived to my room, and after 2 short pushes, my Madison was born at 9:04 a.m. on April 25th, 2003. My second daughter, Madison, was born exactly 2 years, 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 days after my first daughter, Miranda. My OB checked for a heartbeat on Madison, but couldn't find one. She then placed Madison on my chest and cut the umbilical cord. I could feel my sweet baby's skin against my own. She was so warm and moist, just the way a new baby should feel. The nurse wiped her off a bit, wrapped her in the receiving blanket, and gave her back to me. Here was my sweet baby girl. Holding her in my arms was a bit surreal. She was so very tiny, but seemingly perfect. She looked like a peacefully sleeping angel with her hands crossed over her chest. I examined every inch of her little body, from the top of her head to her tippy toes. She was absolutely beautiful. She had whispery, soft blonde eyelashes and eyebrows. About 30 minutes after her birth, the hospital chaplain came to my room and said a prayer over Madison. He offered comforting words to ensure that we knew our sweet angel was in heaven with Jesus. We kept Madison with us for a little over 2 hours. In that time, I experienced a strange sense of calm. I didn't even cry very much when she was with me. I was so focused on her and cherishing the limited time that I had with her that I didn't want it clouded with tears of sorrow. At the same time, I was so exhausted from my horrible evening before her birth that I was afraid I might doze off while holding her and accidentally drop her. So after some time, I let the nurse take her away from me. The nurse informed me that I could have Madison brought to me again if I wanted, but I never did. After 2 hours had passed, I had noticed a change in the color of Madison's skin, from pinkish to purplish to bluish. I didn't want to remember her that way. I wanted to remember her as she looked when she was first born, pink and warm and beautiful. A couple of weeks after saying goodbye to Madison, I started to receive bills in the mail from the hospital, from my OB's office, from the doctor's office, from the pathologist's office. Because my insurance plan covered 80% of my expenses, I was only required to pay approximately $2,000. If my insurance had not covered my termination-related expenses, it would have cost us approximately $15,000. At this point, we were right in the middle of construction on our first house. Any savings we had accumulated were already put towards the house. If we had been stuck with a $15,000 bill, it would have left us financially devastated on top of our emotional devastation. It has been almost 8 years since we said goodbye to Madison. I still think of her daily and cherish the short time that we had together. The emotional healing was difficult at times, with setbacks often coming when I least expected them. But I can say with confidence that I have peace in my heart that I chose what was best for my family. I know that if we were to be put in the exact same situation today, I wouldn't choose any differently. When given the choice between having a guaranteed cleared conscience or being able to prevent my child from suffering, I chose to prevent my child from suffering. Over the years since losing Madison, I have been searching for the silver lining in the dark clouds that hovered over me. I have been finding ways to turn my loss into something positive to honor Madison's memory. I participate in the March of Dimes, March for Babies, every year to help raise funds and awareness for birth defects. I started my own chapter of a volunteer group which knits or crochets baby blankets to donate to bereaved mothers in hospitals and clinics. I'm a volunteer host of an internet message board for women who have terminated a pregnancy for medical reasons. I try my best to make sure that those who have chosen to terminate for medical reasons never feel alone or unsupported. I have since gone on to have another healthy baby, yes, a girl. She is my rainbow baby. Through the clouds and the rain, she came and brought light and color back into my life. At a time in my life when I was terrified of being in that vulnerable state of pregnancy again, she came along and helped me to see how truly blessed my life was. I simply adore her and treasure her spunky personality. Watching her play in the backyard with Miranda, eat popsicles on our front porch in the summertime, and sleep in the room that was to be Madison's is bittersweet at times. It's a simple truth that she wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the decision my husband and I made to let her big sister Madison go. I know that Madison watches over her sisters, her dad, and me from above, and I know in my heart that I will be reunited with my middle daughter someday. For another heartbreaking story about the many things that can happen in pregnancy, I might remind you of Danielle Deaver's story. Let me read you an article from the Omaha World Herald, published in March of 2011. Nebraska was one of the first states to pass a 20-week ban, and Danielle's story shows just how cruel that law is. Danielle Deaver would have stood on her head in a freezer if she could have saved her baby's life. Parents do that kind of thing. But extreme measures wouldn't have mattered for the Grand Island, Nebraska woman and the child she carried last year. That baby was doomed when Deaver's water broke the day after Thanksgiving. It was a new Nebraska abortion law, though, that turned an unbearable situation into one that Deaver and her husband Rob called torturous. The Deavers are going public with their story in hopes of helping other families, including those in Iowa and other states where lawmakers are considering following Nebraska's lead. Deaver had 4 months to go in her pregnancy when she lost most of the amniotic fluid that cushions the fetus and helps its development. She said in an interview on Sunday. Doctors told the Deavers the loss of fluid stopped the baby's lung development and would lead to deformities of the head and limbs. Their baby was given less than a 10% chance of surviving delivery, less than a 2% chance of ever managing basic functions like eating. The odds were awful, Danielle Deaver said. It just wasn't there. But devastating as that blow had been, what followed turned out to be at least as excruciating. The Deavers thought over the possibilities and made a decision. They didn't want to continue putting their unborn baby through what they feared was agony, so they asked the doctors to induce labor early. We were seeking to have the inevitable happen, Danielle Deaver said. We in no way, shape, or fashion were seeking an abortion. But they were soon told that Nebraska abortion law stood in their way. The law, which took effect in October, bans abortions at 20 weeks after fertilization, a point chosen because some experts say it is when a fetus can feel pain. Previous state law followed the standards set by the U.S. Supreme Court. It banned abortions after a fetus could survive outside the womb, typically about 22 weeks after fertilization. The new law permits abortions in the later months of pregnancy only to protect the woman's life or prevent major physical problems. In the eyes of the law, giving medication to induce labor at that stage of pregnancy would be considered an abortion. Since Deaver was healthy and the baby still had a heartbeat, they didn't fit the exemptions in the law. Specialists at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and the couple's primary care doctor in Hastings, Nebraska, agreed that they could risk their medical license and prison time if they did the procedure, so the Deavers were sent home to wait. Danielle Deaver was told to watch for signs of infection, a potential complication of losing amniotic fluid, and she agonized every time she felt the baby move. knowing that the child no longer had any protection from the uterine muscles. I told Rob I didn't know what to pray for, she recalled. But do I pray for a miracle, or do I pray that I get sick enough that we can end this? Deaver finally went into labor on her own on December 7th. The baby, named Elizabeth, was born the next day at 3 p.m., weighing 1 pound, 10 ounces. The Deavers took turns holding her while she gasped for air, but her undeveloped lungs would not inflate and no ventilator could have made a difference. Elizabeth was pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. The Deavers cremated her and had a family service. Recently, they decided to speak out about their experience in the hope of making a difference for other families in similar situations. They have not decided whether to mount a legal challenge to the Nebraska law. We should have been able to make this decision, Danielle Deaver said. This was not about abortion or politics or anything. This was about two parents being able to make an excruciating decision. Rob Deaver said he doesn't believe Nebraska lawmakers considered all the possibilities when they passed last year's law. And the couple are urging lawmakers in other states to slow down before following in Nebraska's footsteps. Bills mirroring this first-of-its-kind law in Nebraska have been introduced in the Iowa legislature, where they have been referred to committees. Similar measures are pending in Kansas, Idaho, Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia, and other states. Speaker of the legislature, Mike Flood of Norfolk, who introduced the Nebraska bill, said the Deaver story is similar to other difficult situations that lawmakers were told about when considering the legislation. His support for the law has not wavered. Even in these situations where a baby has a terminal condition, there is still a life, Flood said. That life is worth protecting. Julie Schmidt-Albin, Executive Director of Nebraska Right to Life, also continues to support the law. Isn't it more humane for the baby to die in a loving manner with comfort, care, in the arms of her parents than by the intentional, painful death through abortion? She asked.
I'd like to inquire with my fellow Missouri.
I yield the mic.